everyone. Just a note before we start this week's podcast. As most of you have probably guessed, we are recording these in our houses during quarantine. This hasn't been a huge problem in the past, but this week was especially noisy and a little hard to edit out because Sonia's neighbor was playing piano the whole time, and it becomes really obvious when you cut into music. The piano is really lovely, but there are some other sounds that were hard to edit out, and so we really hope that you guys listen all the way through because I think this episode is pretty important. Also, just a content warning, around the 45-minute mark, we do start talking about residential and industrial schools and the violence against children that happened in those facilities. So if you want to skip that, that's totally understandable. It's from about the 45-minute mark to about the 1 hour and 10-minute mark. We do think that this history is super important, but also understand that especially for First Nations and Indigenous people, this can be really triggering. So if that doesn't feel safe for you, that's where that discussion is happening. Thanks so much, and I hope you enjoyed the podcast.
Hello, and welcome to the BabaYaga Project. I'm Sonia, and I'm doing a PhD in medieval history.
And I'm Devin, and I have a master's in American history and Indigenous studies.
The BabaYaga Project is a podcast and blog that explores the ritualized year, folklore, and history. This week's topic is back to school.
What up?
Which is going to be a little different this year.
Very different.
But yeah, so this week we're going to be talking about the US and Canadian school systems specifically, and sort of how this emerges from about the 17th and 18th centuries until the present, and sort of how we got to where we are today.
Yeah.
So why don't we actually just start with this whole notion of, like, going back to school? Like, I know there's the whole myth about, like, the kids got a break in the summer to work on the farm, but that seems kind of off, given that, you know, most farm work would be in the spring and in the fall. So, do you want to talk about why we're even going back to school in the fall?
Sure, yeah. So, if you actually look at in rural communities and early schooling, the summer had about as much enrollment and number of classes as they did in the winter, and the times when older students were actually taken out of school to work on farms. It was the spring and fall when you were planting and harvesting. So, meh. The reason that the modern school system is sort of set up around this big empty space in the summer is because of rich people in cities. Where, like, the school systems really sort of originated in these urban settings, and you have this practice of, like, rich people going to summer somewhere. You know, we're gonna get out of the city and go to the Hamptons, or wherever it is that rich people go, and spend the summer, you know, somewhere else. And as, like, you got into, like, a more industrialized America, I hear the piano now.
Yeah, apologies to any of our listeners. I live next to, I think, a classical pianist. I've never actually met this person, but there is a daily piano concert that I can hear through the wall. So if you hear some of that, just count yourself lucky. You get some free music out of the deal, and it's very soothing and nice.
Yeah, so anyway, back to what I was saying. The school systems really originated like the system of schooling originated in these urban settings, and the people who were running the schools just didn't feel like it was worth it if most of the students weren't going to be there. So around major holidays like Christmas and stuff, they would just close the school because so many students weren't going to be there anyway. And then as the summers would come around and a bunch of students, the wealthier students, would leave, and then as the American society became more and more industrialized and you had this larger middle class that was also able to vacation, people, more and more, a larger and larger percentage of students would leave for at least part of the summer. And so it was like, why bother? And once you do that, parents then, but once you do it once, parents tend to like count on it, like, oh, well, we can go and do this because last year they didn't have school at this time. And it's really hard to like then get back to a like year-round school concept. So it's just sort of become the practice, even though a lot of education experts are like, hey, it's better to not have a giant months-long break for young minds. It's better to like keep them stimulated. But we all expect a summer vacation, so that's what we get.
Yeah, I remember when I was in high school, there was, the idea was floated that we would, one of the years we would go back to school before Labor Day, and I think literally everyone kept their kids home through that weekend and didn't send them until after Labor Day, because they were like, absolutely not. Like, no. There are not that many long weekends in the year. We are going to do whatever we had planned for the long weekend, and then we'll send the kids back. So, like, it is this really deeply ingrained, like, thing where it's like you have your summer, kids go to summer camp, or they go, spend time with relatives, or just, like, stay at home and hang out. And then, there's this, like, September, we go back to school, and, like, all the kind of nostalgia, I think, that comes up around that as well. Like, I still want to go out. There's a part of me that's like, go, get a new backpack. Get yourself a nice, shiny new lunchbox. I want crayons in a nice, neat row.
I did just order a new planner and some, like, fancy pens. Because I was like, sweet. It's fall. This is the time to, like, restart my life. Just because I've been so ingrained by spending so much time in school, through grad school. It's just, my whole life has been school.
Same. Yeah, that's, my strategy is to just never leave school. I'm just staying here forever. It seems to be working out okay so far.
I have not managed that yet, but
that's fine and valid. Everyone has a different life strategy. I'm just floating it as a possibility that, you can just stay in education forever. No, that's a lie. I do have to finish my PhD at some point, but it is not this day.
What do we say to graduate committees? Right. Not today.
All right, so let's now that we've waxed poetic about our nostalgia for, going back to school, why don't we kind of have a talk about education and how like formal schooling becomes a thing in North America?
Yeah, so schooling in the way that we think about it now is really a product of the early 20th century, late 19th century. But there were schools in North America, like, sort of as soon as there was like real settlement, right? So the mid 1600s, when you get, like, it really came with all the Puritans. is what we're talking about.
I mean, listen, even a broken clock is right twice a day.
So the Puritans, when you look at, Massachusetts Bay and New Haven and Plymouth, when you look at these early colonies, they really prided themselves on being a literate society. They kept meticulous records, written records, and from the very sort of, once the colonies had been established and society had sort of been established, they had education laws. Children had to be taught how to read.
Huh, I did not know this.
Yeah, so it was really about, because the Puritans had, so you can see this distinction really between New England and the southern, really agrarian colonies really early, because the Anglican Church was the major church in the South, and the Puritans were, and like Calvinists and all of that was what was sort of happening in the North and in New England in particular. And it was really important in this Puritan and Calvinist society that you be able to read the scriptures yourself. And It was still something that was encouraged in Anglican society, but having the an educated pastor was what was really more important. So, so being taught to read was, like, if you did not teach your children how to read, you would be determined to be unfit to care for them. And the child would be taken away and put into an apprenticeship. And because they normally saw, like, the lack of education, the lack of time given to education as a marker of, like, you cannot provide for the child. So it was considered, like, this part of poverty. And since they're, like, Puritans and Calvinists, this idea that, like, you're reaping what you sow, so you're, like, if you're poor, clearly you've done fault. Something wrong. You shouldn't be overly wealthy, but you should have enough to, provide for your family if you're doing God's work, right? So the children that were not taught to read were taken and put into apprenticeships, and apprenticeships had specific rules about education for children. And when we talk about children, we're mostly, that meant male children, but for reading, also girls had to learn how to read. And something that was, like, is also really specific to this time period is that reading and writing are two different skills. They were taught separately. So that's why you get, like, the 3 R's, reading, writing, and arithmetic, because you were taught how to read first, and that was all taught orally. So you would be tested on reading out loud. And as long as you could read out loud, then it was like, okay, you have learned how to read. And then you would learn how to write, and writing was all about penmanship, not necessarily, like, how well you could compose a sentence. It was, like, how well you could basically write letters. And then ciphering was, like, basic arithmetic. And so you would... everyone would have to be taught how to read, was the law, and then boys would also have to be taught how to write, and this was seen as, like, not part of basic education. Basic education was just reading, and then this was, like, a high skill that could only be taught by, like, a master, so a man would have to teach writing, and that was required for boys because, if they wanted to go on to clerk or be a secretary or anything like that, they needed to have excellent penmanship. But also, even if they were going to be farmers or tradesmen, they would have to keep books and be able to write, postings about surplus goods and things like that. so they would need to be able to write. And then basic ciphering was also taught, so that they could, again, keep books and things like that. But the arithmetic wasn't always required in education. That came later. And around the time it started being universally required in New England that boys be taught, again, what was called ciphering or basic arithmetic, that was when more people were starting to consider it important for girls to be taught how to write as well.
Yeah, I think we tend to take for granted the ability to write. Like it's something that we learn so young now, and like it's so universal, but it really is a skill, like those kinds of, like the fine motor skills to be able to do that. Like I'm taking it a little bit out of North America right now and out of this time period, but like, there's the famous, like, Charlemagne, he could read, but he could not write.
Yeah.
Like he was, like, because there is like this historical record about how, like, they were saying like he even into his old age would like really try to write things out, but just, like even with that effort, it was very, very difficult to do that. So I think it's, I think there's something to and that, like, of like separating reading and writing.
Yeah, and you can really look at, there's things about how the textbooks for both of these skills were created that also feeds into this system. So creating the basic primers for learning how to read and having a Bible to learn how to read. These books were widely available to almost everyone in North America, and they were being printed in North America.
Yeah.
But the penmanship books that a master would have to teach people how to write were a lot harder because you would need to have engraved letters for printing script that
right.
often had to be like carved by by master penmen themselves.
Yeah.
And so they were really, really expensive to produce, and so much fewer people had these books, and it was thought that like you couldn't learn how to write from the book, even though essentially what the masters were doing was having you copy from the book. Everything was rote memorization.
Yeah.
It wasn't expected that you could, and this was thought of as like a high skill, right? Coming from this idea that you had scribes.
Yeah, and I think it is worth pointing out that like at this point, right, like, you mentioned rote memorization, like writing things out, right?
Mm-hmm.
Like this isn't a situation where people are, doing like critical thinking or argumentation necessarily as a skill. The point is that like here is knowledge and you have to learn this skill.
Yeah, and you have these different ideas of what learning is, and like, so when we look as historians back at trying to study and determine who is literate at these times, right? A lot of people look at who can sign their name as a determiner of like literacy, but because a lot of people were being taught to read but not to write, you have a lot of people who can't fully sign their name but can read, and various levels of literacy in and of itself. So somebody who is taught to read but not to write often has a struggle reading new material. So they might be really good at reading, say, the Bible or the Psalms or things that they're encountering every day because they hear it so much that it's a lot easier to recognize the words on the page, and they might be able to read, like posters and things that are put up, missives that are put up on town, like on the meeting house or things like that, but probably wouldn't be able to like get a new novel and read it for themselves and really have like reading comprehension in the way that we think about it now, because they're not being taught to engage with the text in the way that when you're taught to read and write at the same time you are. So like full literacy, even among these people who are all like supposedly universally taught to read and tested on their reading by reading the Bible, like probably don't have the level of literacy that would be expected of somebody to like like now, you know.
Right.
And there's like this...
Yeah, and I mean, that makes sense in a way, because it's like, how available were books going to be, really?
Yeah.
You know, like, aside from the Bible, like, what... I mean, I'm not trying to say, like, no, we should, like... You know, I think it is just interesting how, like, different, how, like... Yeah, just, like, how differently we view literacy, and, like, what's the purpose of it.
And yeah, and that's the thing. So the purpose at this period of learning how to read was to make good Christians.
Yes.
Right? So in this period, you have in like English North America, you have this very also gendered idea of teaching.
Right.
So reading was supposed to be taught at home by the mother, generally, because reading was seen as like a low skill task.
Yeah.
And so women could teach it. And teaching your children how to read was this practice of good Christian motherhood, because you're showing them the Bible and engaging with the Bible, right, and those things. And writing and maths were, you know, a high skill task, and so those you would have to go to a school to learn. And so they did have these schools set up for boys who could already read. You know, you would be tested on like reading, how far into like reading the scriptures you were, and your ability to read the scriptures, and then they would take you in to like perfect your reading and teach writing and ciphering. And so that was sort of how schools were done. And all of these schools, obviously, you had to pay to attend.
Right.
So that was sort of the system that was happening in English North America. In French North America, specifically in Quebec, it was a little bit different, because so much of society was controlled by the Catholic Church, because Quebec was established, I mean, as a French colony, but also specifically as like a Catholic colony, and as like a home base for Catholic missionaries in North America. So the schools that you have are set up by priests and or by nuns, and so you would learn how to read from these like schools that were run by nuns. And then they had established like classical colleges in the style that would have existed in Europe, where you would, you know, learn Greek and Latin and reading and writing and argumentation in a way that would prepare you for becoming a priest or going on to to read the law and like apprentice as a lawyer or a politician or something like that. You know, it was a stepping stone to seminary, essentially, to then like continue spreading Catholicism throughout North America. That was the goal of that in the 17th century, like New France. And then as you get into English North America, as you get to the 18th century, and especially like the later 18th century, you start having more and more women teaching children who are not theirs, you know, as the towns sort of expand and there's more like specification of jobs and things like that, you know, like where more people have like a trade or something. School dames became a thing, where before children went to school, they would go to, you know, some married woman's house where she would teach them how to read and like the basics of the Bible. It was essentially like kind of like a Sunday school, you know, to teach reading, because reading was again something that women could do. And then as you get into sort of like the New Republic, right, with the War of Independence, you have this idea of Republican motherhood. So more and more women are taught how to write as well and how to do arithmetic, because the idea was that that would make them better mothers to sons who were then going to be participating in this new democracy. So these Enlightenment ideals of like education and reason and democracy are, you know, sort of seep into the rest of society. So more and more girls are sent to school and are educated because that will make them better mothers to future citizens, and that like we needed this great base of citizens to, you know, run the country, and that didn't include women, right? You know, we just needed them to raise and do the early education for these new citizens. And a sort of similar thing happens in late 18th century Quebec as well, but in a kind of different vein, right? So by the late 18th century, Quebec is now part of English, not English, but like Canada. You know, it's part of this English colony. They had been conquered by England, and so there was this idea that they had to educate the women to make better French Catholic families. You know, so like any sort of education was again done through the church because it was about preserving this French Catholic society in Quebec in the face of the very Anglo New America and then like Anglo Canada and the state that was becoming and, like, Canada.
By this point, I mean, to my knowledge about it, like, you know, you kind of have this, like, like, Canada as part of the British Empire already. Like, it's...
Yes. So the the English-speaking Canada, Anglo-Canada, was... They were not Canadians, they were British subjects.
I just
Canadians were French. Because there had been, for almost a full century, just sort of a disconnect between Quebec and France. Like, Quebec wasn't producing enough, or like, and it was just, France was continuously at war. They were just like relatively uninterested in supporting New France. So Quebec had sort of become its own society in and of itself. They were French Canadians, the people of the St. Lawrence. And so that's where the term Canadian was really, at this point in time, referred to French Quebecers. And the English speakers of Canada were British.
Yes.
They were British colonial subjects.
I just wanted to...
And that's how Americans thought of themselves, as, like, you know, people from the United States thought of themselves that way too, until, right, the Revolution, the War for Independence. Then they became, well, eventually they became Americans.
Yeah. Well, that's another topic for another time.
The use of the term American is a whole long history. So initially they were Colombians and all sorts of other things. Like, it was a... My people have a strange linguistic history.
Don't we all, Devin?
But so coming out of the 18th century, going into the 19th century, right, in the mid-19th century, you get, you know, rapid industrialization, people moving to cities, and that's when you get this common school movement.
Yes.
Right, so that comes out of this idea of this Republican motherhood, and out of these imperial ideas in English Canada, that in order to have functioning citizens and like good imperial British citizens who are going to serve the empire or serve the new democracy of America, they need to be educated. And so specifically in cities, but eventually in more rural areas as well, you get this common school movement, where all children would go to school through about grade 8, and this is where you get the like idea of the one-room schoolhouse, where these ideas sort of came out of Germany and made their way into like English society and through to North America, where you have like the teacher who teaches mostly the older students and then uses the older students to teach younger students, all in sort of this one room. And that then in the late 19th century is really taken by the progressive movement as, oh, if we educate people, it'll, you know, lift them out of poverty. And you have all of these progressive women, like, you know, trying to educate, set up schools next to factories to, and as you get, you know, more child labor laws, children aren't able to be in the factories where their parents are, and so somebody needs to like be watching them, and these progressive women set up these charity schools,
right,
to educate children and make better citizens. It was really about educating people for their own good.
and that's,
you know, that was sort of the language of it. It's weird and like good, but also very kind of like
condescending,
patronizing.
Yes.
Like the progressive movement was so condescending, like, oh, these poor people, we must lift them out of poverty with you know, it's whatever.
And this idea
with
of
our charity,
you know, like education is going to be this great leveler, when like in the, you know, whereas it is this very patronizing, condescending thing, because it's like yes, obviously I'm all for education, but like it doesn't it's not a great leveler. Like at the end of the day, like if you're born into poverty, it is much harder to, you know, like get ahead in life. You know, like it doesn't suddenly fix everything.
And what kind of education
exactly.
are you going? The other thing is like, what kind of education are you going to get? Because the common schools that were being set up were not going to teach the same things that the...
Yeah, sorry, I
Are you okay?
Something.
Okay. So the other thing is like, what kind of education are you going to get? Because the schools, these common schools that children of factory workers and farmers are going to be going to are not going to teach the same things that elite private schools or the classical colleges are going to be teaching. You know, it's not going to be teaching the things to get you to a university. It's going to be teaching the sort of rudiments of government, the ideas that you should have about your country, religion, basic reading, basic writing, basic maths, and that's what you're going to get. So it's this, and like for girls, you know, you'd get like homemaking skills as well, probably, especially if you went to one of these like progressive schools. They would teach you how to care for children, and you know, the basics of nutrition and things like that, as like, and hygiene. You know, it was like this weird, they're always going to be poor, but we can make them less gross, essentially. Not like that's really what it was. Like the progressives are so weird, and like that it's the responsibility of rich people like to know what to do with money. Like it wasn't that people shouldn't be, you know, Rockefeller rich, just that Rockefeller should, because obviously he is so wise, that's why he made all of this money, he should have the wisdom to know how to use his money to better all of society. Like that was this very progressive, I mean, like there's this bizarre essentially like a manifesto that Andrew Carnegie wrote about how like poor people are always going to be poor and stupid, and that like if you're able to lift yourself out of poverty, then clearly you're a genius, and if you have a lot of money, then like clearly you earned it, even though like the progressive era was also just like a period of horrifying exploitation of workers. So the rich people aren't really earning anything.
I mean, that's
whatever. But like, so then that is clearly a testament to how brilliant these people are, and that they have to be the geniuses of society to help all of society. And that's why you have like Carnegie libraries and universities and like Rockefeller libraries and these things. Like, it was what you were supposed to do with your money was to give it back to society, so that, like, you know, if Carnegie in this article's like specific thing is about libraries and like public services like that, so that if there is the good poor person who's going to, you know, stop drinking and stop going to the bars and instead go and educate himself at the library so he can, you know, learn how to not be so poor or whatever. Like, it's really weird. It's a really weird
I mean, to be clear, I think it's you know, it would be, it's slightly better than, like, Jeff Bezos. You know?
Yeah, because at least like,
there is still got a library out of the deal. I mean, you know.
Yeah. So
it's not
that's
great, but like,
that's the
somehow better than what we're dealing with now.
Yeah. So that's the common school movement. You don't, to go back to the like bit of Canada that's different from what's happening in the States, because like the English Canadian models sort of follow the US, right? With maybe a little bit more English influence, because they are more explicitly like religious Protestant
and like there's
being established in English Canada than in the US, where it was supposed to be like not necessarily secular, because everything is very waspy in the States as well, but it's this, and it's a similar common school movement, except for in Quebec, where they explicitly defund what was initially a public school movement, to make sure that all of the schools are these Catholic schools. And there actually is a crisis of education at one point in time where there was no funding in the mid-19th century, the 1860s, I think, where there was no money for schools. The provincial government hadn't ensured, they hadn't written a new school bill, and so there was no money being sent to teachers, and so these teachers weren't being paid, and so the boys weren't getting educated, and so then outside of these schools that were set up by nuns, there wasn't really education for all. There wasn't French Catholic education for everyone. There were a lot of these schools for girls that were set up by nuns, and so you have a lot of French Canadian women who can read and do maths and things like that. And there's more of a crisis for the like lower classes of French Canadian men who weren't, the schools had shut down, the male teachers weren't being paid, and so they had left. Those schools, those men weren't getting the higher education outside of learning to read and stuff at home, unless you were wealthy enough to go attend a classical college and or seminary. So there is this very distinct hierarchy of education amongst French Canadian men, whereas women were not going to go, they weren't allowed to in the classical colleges until the very late 1800s, when the University of Laval set up a program for women, and there was a one college established for women so that they could go to this university program. Oh, that's the other thing for anybody listening in the States. The term college in Canada is used in the British way, where a college is where you go before university if you do that. Like, it's not specifically in French Canada. The college is preparatory
and then
for
in
university.
English Canada, college and university
modern
are like
cégep.
two different things. Like college is like hands-on.
Yeah, so yeah, in
like,
English Canada,
more like career job training.
It's like trade school or a community college in the States.
Oh, okay. Yeah.
What that would be. Whereas college, so there's community college and or trade school, and then there's college, which gives you a 4-year degree. So those are all colleges in the U.S. In Canada, in English Canada, the college is just the trade school, or what we would call a community college, and then there's university. And then in French Canada, college is closer to like what they call a cégep now. So you go and do 2 years after high school before you go to university. Yeah. Anyway, those are all terms that I should have clarified at the beginning of this for people in the U.S. So women until the late 1800s in Quebec weren't able to go to these colleges, and so they weren't able to go to university. But they were getting more of like a standard primary education than a lot of the working class men were. Yeah, and that again changes with Confederation and the federal, like establishing federal laws around education, and that like schools have to exist. So the schools are run by provinces with Confederation in Canada, but there's an established expectation of like providing primary schools. And so like in Quebec, they are still Catholic schools, and there's this huge crisis around whether or not there's going to be French Catholic schools in the other more English-speaking provinces, and it becomes like this massive political crises around whether or not the Canadian federal state will continue to exist, or if there's going to be like a massive sovereigntist movement in Quebec, and it's all centered around, whether or not Ontario is going to provide state-funded French Catholic schools.
Fun fact,
it's a whole thing.
They still do.
We don't need to get into it. They do. They did. It was a concession that then became like this huge issue again with World War I, and whether or not they were going to continue to fund these schools when they should be funding.
Yeah,
English
it's a whole thing. But
it was a whole thing.
Yeah, fun fact: Ontario and I think a few other provinces still do have both French and English public schools and French and English Catholic schools.
Yeah. And again, difference from the US, the Catholic schools are funded.
Oh, yeah, like
by
I meant
the
like
state.
as a like those are all publicly funded. That those are all publicly funded options. Like you don't have to pay to go to any of them. You just go to your designated school.
Yeah. Whereas in the US in the 20th century, Jehovah's Witnesses made sure that there were no publicly funded religious education, because in the US Constitution, the state cannot support one religion over any other, and so that's why you no longer have like prayer in school and religious education funded by the state. Anyway, getting back to the early 20th century. So now we've moved out of this progressive movement and the common schools, but they're still not like high school in the way that we think of it now. There were a few high schools throughout English North America, but they were really, really small. And so like in the early 1910s, about 10% of people had a high school education. But from 1910 to 1930, you have, in the US specifically, followed closely by Canada, you have what's called the high school movement. And it's the largest and fastest growth of public secondary education in history. And it happens in the US about 20 to 50 years sooner than the rest of the world. So there's this just massive and very fast movement to establish secondary schools, so to establish high schools, so all education after
Right.
8th grade, essentially. So most people went to school through 8th grade and then they would stop and go to work. Now you have this movement to get secondary education, and this was a sort of startling development for how quickly it is, because it, for those 4 years of secondary education, it costs as much as the entire common school
Right.
education for each student, right? So you have 8 years of primary education that costs as much as just those 4 years of secondary education. So this is a massive expenditure. And the reason that they were able to sort of get everyone on board with funding these public schools, these public high schools, is because of the mass industrialization. So you have all of this industrialization and just rapid progression of technology. So this is the era of radio and automobile and all of the factories that are building all of these things. And you need skilled workers who understand, you know, the basics of technology and science and math to be able to build all of these things. So it's called, the 20th century is called the human capital century in discussions of like using social capital for education, because the argument was no longer about, you know, creating good citizens for secondary education, right? That's still the argument for primary education. Right. But for secondary education, it's really about, we need to have educated workers to continue creating all of this technology and advancing us into the 20th century. That's going to be like the century of the future.
And I think it's, I mean, just as an aside, I think it is, you know, kind of when there are these debates going on now about like, okay, we need to make university or like college like more accessible to people, and how do we do that? And, you know, these ideas of, hey, maybe we should just like make it free for anyone who wants to and is able to go. And like, I think it is interesting to look back on this period to see like, you know, these kind of similar ideas like around high school, that it's like,
that it's about educating workers rather than education. And
I also think it's just kind of like, you know, remembering that like we take going to high school for granted, that like of course the state will pay for me to go to high school, when like until relatively recently that would not have been the case at all. Like, so this was like a rapid shift, right? So you have 10% of people have a high school education in 1910. By 1930, like, it's 50%. Nuts. And it only continues to grow from there. Even through the Great Depression, through World War II, you have people consistently building schools in places where they weren't, and just investing massive amounts of public capital into building these schools and educating children. And it really leads to what our modern 20th century idea of North America, because you have World War II happen, right? So all of these young men who are being shipped overseas or participated in like the factories and all these things that we have, you know, happens in World War II, they're all going into that with a high school education. And so when you come back and the US implements the GI Bill, so free university for those, or, you know, trade school or community college for people who served, that was only possible because of the high school movement, because so many people had already had the secondary education. They're able to get these post-secondary educations, and then when they have these free or very, very cheap college degrees, that creates the massive number of white-collar workers that you see in the 1950s that funds the, you know, suburbanization,
that funds the, massive automobile and single family home purchases that you see in the 1950s that create this idea of what America is, and this massive boom in economic power that the United States in particular has, followed closely by Canada afterwards. So you have, that's this high school movement into the GI Bill is a major part of what funds us, along with, the US not being completely destroyed in the way that Europe was in World War II, and having funded the Allies and producing all of these factories to create defense products, weapons and stuff for World War II that are later, converted into factories for consumer products. Along with that, you have this educated population, at the time, the best educated population in the world. And Canada is, English Canada is basing its education system off of the States as well. And so, progressing on a similar trajectory.
Yeah.
Yeah. So it's and I mean, Canada has a little of a different situation coming out of World War II because of their ties to Britain and being part of this empire that is irrevocably changed by World War II. So they're dealing with a little bit of a different economic status, but yeah, it's a similar movement in education in Canada, and obviously Canada still has mostly state-funded university as well. So,
well, yeah, I mean, it's not fully state funded, but it's definitely kept.
Oh yeah, but I mean, in comparison to the
US, yes, there's a lot more. There's a lot more done in line to to keep the prices, somewhat something resembling reasonable, and there is a lot more government grants and low interest loans available as compared to a lot of places in the US.
Yeah. Yeah. But yeah. So that's the sort of overarching theme of education in North America. But underneath this, which it all seems okay, but this is also specifically from this very white Anglo-Protestant idea of society, right? That it's good to go off and get this education, even if it is a Christian education, and to learn how to be a good citizen of the United States or Canada or Quebec, whatever. But running underneath that, we have this other system of schooling happening at the same time, and this comes out of missionary schools in indigenous nations.
Yes.
Right?
Yeah.
If you're in Canada, especially because there's been so much conversation about this in Canada, you're going to know where I'm going with this. So we're going to talk about residential schools. So, particularly on the East Coast, sort of the Appalachian kind of area, from the end of the 18th century, you have missionary schools established in indigenous nations, right? There's this big push to make sure that indigenous people, even if you're teaching them in an indigenous language, can learn how to read. So there's a lot of transcribing indigenous languages into the Roman alphabet, which doesn't always work out great, to ensure that indigenous people can read the Bible.
Great.
This is sort of what pushes Sequoia to create the Cherokee syllabary, which is actually way more effective at creating a literate population in Cherokee Nation than the transliteration into the Latin alphabet is. Once the syllabary is created, right, if you speak Cherokee, you can learn if you already speak Cherokee, you can theoretically learn how to read from the syllabary in 3 days. And once the Cherokee Nation itself starts establishing schools to teach people the syllabary, they reach 95% literacy in 5 years. It's insane. A similar thing happens in Hawaii, where it is transliterated into the Latin alphabet, but because of the way that the Hawaiian language works, like literacy just takes off super quickly, and actually writing in the Hawaiian language becomes this really fascinating means of resisting American imperialism. But outside of these examples of, like sort of empowering indigenous culture, mostly the missionary schools are used to teach English, force people to become Christians because you couldn't attend the school if you were going to continue to practice an indigenous religion. And eventually they become these boarding schools called, in the States, and initially when they're set up, they're called industrial schools, and they're these boarding schools where what's called the Office of Indian Affairs in the US requires the indigenous nations, as they're being sort of moved and pushed off their land and pushed into land that's not as arable, in order to receive government assistance for the nation, the children have to attend these industrial schools where the children are going to be taught how to be, proper, quote unquote, civilized people. It's super screwed up. And so because the nations are being undermined systematically by the American state, they need the government assistance because, for example, the Cherokee Nations moved to Oklahoma, that we've talked about before. In the plains, in the mid-19th century, there's what are still known as the Indian Wars are going on, where the U.S. Army is actively combating indigenous people in order to take their land and killing off wild food sources. So the utter decimation of the buffalo population in the Great Plains leads to indigenous dependency on the American state and, a sort of desperation to be able to feed their children, and the industrial schools are a way to make sure that your children will be fed, as opposed to sort of watching a generation starve to death on reservations, right, which was incredibly common. And so these industrial schools are set up, and in Canada, right, the first Prime Minister, Johnny MacDonald, sends a journalist, I can't remember his name, to go and research what the Americans are doing with their indigenous people. And he comes back and talks about these industrial schools, and that's when MacDonald sets up the residential school system in Canada. And they're essentially the same thing, though the industrial schools in the States are only sort of vaguely overseen by the Office of Indian Affairs, where in Canada it is explicitly state-run schools. And what happens at these schools is aggressive assimilation. So in both the United States and English Canada, the children are taken from their parents at a very young age. Their hair is cut. They are not allowed to wear their traditional clothing. They're not allowed to speak their language. And they're not allowed to practice their religion or traditions or eat their traditional foods. Anything that resembles the life that they were leading in their own nation before is completely stripped away from them. And because they're so young, often children completely, and they stay there until they're adults, they're completely divorced from their culture. And it is discussed now in Indigenous studies circles and in most of North American history as a cultural genocide, and just horrifyingly traumatic. These schools are also particularly abusive and use corporal punishment long after most American schools have decided that that's not, an effective or moral way of teaching children. They're also used for scientific testing in really horrible ways. The children there was one in particular in the US where there was a university and government funded study of what starvation does to early development in, like, you know, studying the brain. And so they systematically starved children at these residential schools to see what happened to them and Christ. Like how it affected their behavior and their ability to learn. And these schools are systematically underfunded, especially in Canada. They are not, like, kept warm enough.
Yeah.
And which is, like, obviously a huge problem in Canada where it's very, very cold. So they're you know, not get the parts of the schools where the children live do not have enough fuel to keep fires going all day, which you have to have, and they're systematically underfunded in terms of, like, getting food. So children were often, you know, anytime they were allowed outside, were eating anything they could find, sometimes poisoning themselves with it in an attempt to sustain themselves. Also, like, children would run away and try and find their way back home, and would sometimes succumb to exposure, but if they did make it back, the state would come after them and punish them and punish the parents if the parents didn't immediately return them to the schools. And in both the US and Canada, parents on reserves would be deemed unfit to care for their children regardless of any actual circumstances, and the children would become wards of the state and would not, like, the parents would never be told where the child was being taken or given any information about these children. So just complete break in familial connections. And when the children were old enough to graduate and leave these facilities, if they lived long enough to graduate and leave the facility, they would not be given any information about who their parents were or where to find them or where they came from or anything like that. So it's just, like, an absolute horror, and not just cultural genocide, because these schools were so systematically underfunded and the children were treated so horribly. A huge portion of students at these schools in the US and in Canada died. You know, they would get sick or, you know, not be fed enough, and there are huge cemeteries at the sites where these schools were, and so it's a literal genocide. These schools functioned essentially as, like, concentration camps and labor camps. The children would be doing unpaid labor a lot of the time. In Canada, they were used for, like, lumber as well. Like, these children would be, like, you know, preparing lumber to be shipped places. It's utterly bizarre and horrifying. And this lasted well into the late 20th century. So there are people who are, like, my parents' age in the US and Canada. They were shut down.
Yeah, I think Canada's weren't shut down until, like, the mid-1990s.
So, I mean, in the US, there are people who are, like, my parents' age who were in residential schools. In Canada, it's, you know, much younger generations are also victims of residential schools, and it is a horrible black mark on the history of the whole continent. They were absolutely just tools of state-sanctioned violence.
Yeah, and I also wanted to
that's
say that the other another, like, you know, as we're talking about education, it's also the fact that, you know, kind of covering up how this all happened and like the history behind all of this is still very actively a thing. Like, it wasn't until a few years ago that residential schools were actually formally put into the Ontario curriculum as a history thing. So like you grow.
Yeah, and they're not talked about in
Like
in standard education.
I mean, obviously
in the
I
US
can't
either
speak for every single school in Canada, but like I had it presented to me when I was going through, like, I guess maybe like grade 6 or grade 7 as like, you know, kind of this like, oh yeah, they set up boarding schools and Indigenous children went to these boarding schools and sometimes, you know, bad things happened and there was abuse, but like overall it was like just a boarding school. And then, you know, like as you get older and you go and read like actual other sources of what was really happening, you're like, how yeah, just like and I think this kind of leads into what we were talking about before this, is like how every education system does, you know, have a you know, kind of political and socio-cultural like agendas, and that's, you know, they all have these, to a certain degree, like indoctrination ideas in them.
Yeah, so that was where I was gonna go with like concluding this discussion, because I think that talking about specifically the assimilation aspects of residential schools really brings us back to what we were talking about with the beginning of schooling in North America, with how creating schools and a school system was very much, especially like early education, was very much about creating the kind of citizen that you wanted in the country. And that even to this day, that's how especially elementary education works. It's about presenting the ideas of the nation,
right,
that the nation wants to like perpetuate. So, right, if we were taught about residential schools at all, it was just that they were boarding schools that the state set up to help Indigenous people, and that was only if there was any acknowledgement of Indigenous people existing, you know, after 1850 at all. There was no talk about like the American Indian movement or Wounded Knee or anything like that when I was in school in North Carolina. But especially in the US, you have early history education is about how great the US was, how great the Constitution is, how every part of American history is moving toward more freedom and happiness and equality as you go along this wonderful path toward, you know, modern America, and how great and excellent, how it's the best country in the world, you know, like America was founded and everything was great. But then we realized that like slavery wasn't great, so we had a civil war about it, and then people were still kind of mean to black people, but then there was a civil rights movement and everything was fixed. And it's like there is so there's just so much that's left out of that, and the idea of who is an American, what Americans look like, all those things. And you see that in Canada as well throughout the history of education in Quebec. I don't know as much about English Canada. I know so the early school system in English Canada was about creating the, you know, good British imperial subjects, and in Quebec it was these good French Catholics who believed in a a French nation in North America, so the nationhood of Quebec, and like really like making sure that that was part of the elementary education, that like you're going to be educated in French, you're going to be educated at Catholic school, and like that specific indoctrination. And in the US it's very much these Anglo-Protestant values and the idea of what the American democracy is, and that any critique of, you know, the Constitution or how the American state is established is not valid, right? So that cultural indoctrination, and ensuring that like all of the schools are set up in this very systematic way. There's, you know, that idea that like schools are set up the way that they are, modern schools are set up with the bell system and all of these things to mimic factory work. And it's really, that's not it. It's not to make submissive factory workers. It's to make citizens who are okay, like who are taught that they have freedom, but are also indoctrinated in this idea of respecting authority because it is authority, right? So that's how the school is set up, and it was set up to mirror the patriarchal family, and then outside of that to mirror the patriarchal church, and outside of that to mirror the patriarchal nation. So you have the school and the family, the church, and the nation, and all of them are the levels of authority within the state that we want to perpetuate and keep going. And so like if you look at the history, and if you look at what people have expressly said in establishing all of these things, if you look at the records, it's, you know, we want to make sure that, you know, we're going to educate girls so that they can teach their sons, and we want to educate the sons so that they can be good citizens. And by good citizens we mean people who are members of this particular church, and the members of this particular church are going to support this state and this vision of the state that we have. And like it's expressly laid out in founding documents for all of these levels of society. And then to look at the most extreme examples of this in residential schools, where it's, you know, your people like to think that they're their own nation, but really this is American land and you're going to be American. And it was, you know, the phrase of like, teach the Indian out of the child, or save the child from the Indian within, right? You know, we're going to make you a good American, and we have very specific ideas of what a good American is, or a good Canadian. You know, the school system is set up expressly to indoctrinate children into being okay with the kind of authority that the state power, like the kind of authority,
right,
supported by the state power, right? And this is all now sounding like I really hate schools. And I don't. I love schools. That's clearly why I stayed in them for all of my entire life. But there is a problem with this formal education, and you see the specific critiques of that. If we do go back to the progressive movement and we look at the anarchists and communists who were writing at the time, again, I'm going to pitch some Emma Goldman, who wrote a lot about education and creating education that is run by students and is a place for exploration and critical thinking, as opposed to memorization.
And I do think values, that there's,
you know, so,
you know, not to, like I've also stayed at school just forever, and you know, I don't want to, you know, be too disparaging, because I'm also like, yes, on one hand, I mean, universal education, fantastic, great idea. But yeah, there's definitely something to be said about how do we present this type of education, and how do we, what exactly are we teaching? And I do think that there's, it's encouraging seeing that at least to some degree there's, there have been small incremental changes over time towards looking more at like childhood development and how children actually learn. And, I hope that that continues in the future. And I mean, this school year is obviously going to be very strange for everyone.
Yeah. So, yeah, and so, like, what I have been sort of thinking about with this is, like, we're at a moment where schooling is probably going to change forever. And, I think it's a time to reflect on, right, these issues of schooling, but also the ways that we talk about why schooling is valuable, right? Because we talk about it in terms of the citizen and the worker, and these ways that, like, all of these these ways that people can be valuable to the state and to capitalism. Whereas and this is, me spouting obviously political opinions, but this could be a time where we reevaluate the school system and look at the school system and say, education is valuable, and universal education is valuable because people are valuable and knowledge is valuable, and that's it. People have a right to know things because they're humans, like everyone has the right to come from the same basis of knowledge, that if there's knowledge out there,
yes, everyone
has a right to it, and that it is valuable in and of itself, not just for the productivity that knowledge can
and I think there's also just something to be said about learning things that are not necessarily ever going to be financially useful for you. I say as a person studying medieval history, but I mean, and genuinely, you see how quick schools are to cut, music programs and art programs and these things that we're now, slowly people are kind of realizing, like, oh, actually, kids who learn how to play music, like, there's a lot of benefits to learning music. There's a lot of benefits to letting kids, like, paint and draw and have these outlets for creativity. And, like, it's this very, like, I think we also need to broaden what knowledge is.
The value of
mm-hmm.
Yeah, and the value of, like, critical thinking skills. But an early school system doesn't want to teach critical thinking skills, because then people are going to be like, start thinking critically about the state and about state power and state violence and, the vast the vast wealth disparity and is Jeff Bezos doing anything to earn $200 billion?
Devin, it's because he works 200 billion times harder than the rest of us.
So, like, I mean, critical thinking and universal knowledge bases and the equity of knowledge is dangerous to the state. So there's that, the radical education is part of a radical movement.
Well,
is where I'm at with that. Those are my conclusions from this, is that we should utterly reform all primary and secondary education and focus on, teaching the process of learning so that people can be lifelong learners and so that they can think critically about the information that they're getting. And
the other thing is, it's never too late to become a lifelong learner either. I mean, we've been roasting, these libraries, but genuinely, I mean, go take advantage of it. Some rich person made a library. Go read things.
No. Libraries are excellent. There should be libraries everywhere. There should be more libraries than there are Starbucks, and I love them. They're one of the only safe, third spaces, free third spaces, so a place other than where you go to work for money and
it's one of the few,
your domestic life. A third space is like the other space, but it's free. It's a
libraries are one of the few places where you're allowed to exist without spending
it's full
money.
Of books. and
also
internet.
There's often lots of
and there's books, there's the internet, there's people to help you navigate books in the internet.
I would also add
the most democratic place in the world.
Community centers as well. There's a lot of the time, it's not necessarily free, but there's usually low cost classes in everything from, playing musical instruments. There's art classes. There's language classes. There's all kinds of different things that you can learn, for free or for cheap in your communities. There's also, if you go looking for it, there's lots of groups out there that do we're a group that likes beekeeping and we meet to do that, or we're a group that does, whatever thing you might be interested in. And I think it's, going into this September, there is a lot to rethink about education for children, but also for and how we
community spaces, community
as adults can continue to learn new things and develop new skills and just have this ability to keep doing new things and trying out new things.
Yeah. So I think
yes,
that should
conclusion.
be our for the past few episodes we've said, here's what you can do to acknowledge or celebrate this time in our year. So this is our going back to school time, and even if you're an adult who's not in school and not going back to school or not a teacher or something like that, this could be a great time to get a library card or join your community center or start taking a class or go to your town hall meeting about funding for community education in the library and stuff like that, or volunteer at your library.
Exactly. There's lots of ways.
One of those kinds of things, get involved in
there's a lot of ways to be involved in public education and to build community around this idea of learning new things and sharing the knowledge that you have. And on that note, thank you so much for joining us. You can check out the blog for more information about seasonal rituals and history. Follow us on Twitter and Instagram for updates. Please leave us a review on iTunes. It means a lot. And also, if you have the means, consider supporting us on Patreon. We have exclusive merch, and it would really help us to expand the project. As always, stay safe and do good work.
Conjunction, junction, what's your function?
Hooking up words and phrases and clauses.
Conjunction, junction, how's that function?
I got 3 favorite cards that get most of my job done.
Conjunction, junction, what's their function?
I got and, but, and, or, they'll get you pretty far. And, that's an adjective, like this and that. But, that's sort of the opposite. Not this, but that. then there's or, O-R. When you have a choice like this or that, and but more gets you pretty far.
Conjunction, junction, what's your function?
Hooking up two boxcars and making them run right. Milk and honey, bread and butter, peas and rice.
Hey, that's nice.
Dirty but happy, digging and scratching, losing your shoe and a button or two. He's poor but honest, sad but true. Boo-hoo!
Conjunction, junction, what's your function?
Hooking up two cars to one when you say something like this. Choice, either now or later, or no choice. Neither now nor ever.
Hey, that's clever.
Eat this or that, grow thin or fat. Never mind, I wouldn't do that, I'm fat enough now.
Conjunction, junction, what's your function?
Hooking up phrases and clauses that balance like out of the frying pan and into the fire. He cut loose the sandbags, but the balloon wouldn't go any higher. Let's go up to the mountains or down to the seas. You should always say thank you or at least say please.
Conjunction, junction, what's your function?
Hooking up words and phrases and clauses in complex sentences like, in the mornings when I'm usually wide awake, I love to take a walk through the gardens and down by the lake, where I often see a duck and a drake. And I wonder as I walk by just what they'd say if they could speak. Although I know that's an absurd thought.
Conjunction, junction, what's your function?
Hooking up cars and making them function.
Conjunction, junction, how's that function?
I like tying up words and phrases and clauses.
Conjunction, junction, watch that function.
I'm gonna get you there if you're very careful.
Conjunction, junction, what's your function?
I'm going to get you there